Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm going to be talking about my experiences reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, this is one of the most well-loved and well-known works ever written in the English language. It's one of those classics that I knew I would inevitably have to get around to reading at some point in my life, so I decided it was finally time to take the plunge and give this thing a fair shake. And I have to admit, I went into this book feeling quite proud and or prejudiced. Part of the reason I was biased against Jane Austen is that there existed this false dichotomy in my mind where there are two types of readers: Bronte sister fans and Jane Austen fans. So at one side of the spectrum you've got the kind of light and fluffy Jane Austen people who are looking for a nice feel-good marriage plot, and then on the other hand you've got the Bronte sisters fans who are interested in a lot more of the darker and stormier elements of love. So I really thought you couldn't be both, you're either into one type of story or the other, which I realize now is completely untrue. Of course we don't need to define ourselves by our preferences, and you can be in the mood for different types of stories at different times in your life. And I kind of realized that I'm pitting female authors against each other in a way that I feel like is unnecessary, and I probably wouldn't do with male authors. So I'm going to move away from that mindset, and I am happy to report back that even though I would much prefer reading a Bronte sister novel over this, I do have to say that it was quite pleasant and I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. Part of the reason I had been so put off from ever picking up this book was its iconic opening line that goes a little something like this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." And I thought, I'm kind of a postmodern reader and I have no use for universal truths. What kind of value am I going to gain in this book? But then I started it and I realized that opening line does not mean what I thought it does. And really that line is just undermining the perspective of one of the characters, Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet is so single-minded and obsessed with finding good husbands for her daughters that she doesn't understand that the way that she sees the world, her universal truths do not line up with what other people see. So she's kind of making fun of the single-mindedness of Mrs. Bennet. I enjoyed when Jane Austen challenged the social norms of her time period, especially in regards to the bogus inheritance laws, where basically a estate has to be passed down to a male relative. So in the Bennet family, they have all daughters, so they're basically going to be losing their house and their money and their lifestyle, everything they've ever known, to this sort of weird, distant cousin of theirs who is also a ridiculous clergyman, Mr. Collins. So you really see how unfair the situation is, and it really makes you think about the motivation of the parents of this family. Mrs. Bennet is the worst a lot of the time. She is always embarrassing her daughters. She's this obvious social climber. She is a petty woman. She makes so many ridiculous remarks. But at the same time, I kind of have to respect that she is a mama bear, and she is doing what needs to get done in order to get her daughters married off to men so that they can live a good life. So I sort of understand where she's coming from. Mr. Bennet, on the other hand, he's kind of chill and laid back, and he makes a lot of sassy and funny remarks, cutting up the people around him. But at the same time, he's so useless, and he's not very invested in his daughter's future. And why would he be, right? He's going to be dead. He doesn't really have to live to see what's going to happen to his family falling apart without him. So even though he was kind of like a funny character to read about, he was actually such a terrible patriarch of this family. The female characters in this novel have to make a lot of difficult decisions about marriage and whether they think it's more important to secure themselves with a solid man who can guarantee them a comfortable life, even if he's not a person that they might necessarily admire very much, or do you hold off from those kind of material comforts and try to wait around for someone that you think that you might love, if that person will ever show up in your life, because you don't really have a lot of agency to go around approaching men and striking up a conversation. So you really do see how trapped a lot of these women are. One of my favorite scenes in the novel is when Elizabeth Bennet, our heroine, is presented with an opportunity to make a very comfortable match, and if she were to marry this man, she would secure her own future and the future of her entire family. So you'd think in a different novel that this would be a very selfless thing that a truly good woman would do, right? She would sacrifice her own happiness to guarantee the security of her whole family. But of course, Elizabeth is not that kind of character, and she decides to turn down this marriage proposal quite definitively without thinking about it very much. So that's kind of why I see that people can really admire Elizabeth. She's not here to be some kind of passive paragon of female goodness and selflessness. Elizabeth just wants to have a laugh in life, and she wants to have a good time, and she wants to live life on her own terms, which I feel like is quite hella admirable. I think this book would have been a lot cooler if it was about Elizabeth going off and having her own adventures, making her own way in the world, and providing a lot of shady commentary about the people around her. But unfortunately, Elizabeth really gets dragged down as a character by her involvement with Mr. Darcy. So maybe that's a blasphemous thing to think, but I really did not care for the central relationship in this book. My main issue with the relationship is that it all seems very obvious. Like, one, you know where the relationship is going to go right away, and two, Jane Austen is using this as her vehicle to expand on her thoughts about pride and prejudice and the way that we judge people and form these misconceptions, whether that be through love or through hatred, whatever. It just seemed like too heavy-handed what she was doing. On the other hand, I liked that these two are basically kind of socially awkward people who are able to form an understanding with one another. I mean, that was kind of how I read Mr. Darcy. I get that he's supposed to look like this big jerk at the beginning, but let's face it, Mr. Darcy is just a huge nerd. And I quote, "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." Mr. Darcy is basically someone who lacks some social niceties, but I feel like it's not because he's a terrible person. He's just super socially awkward and like heavily introverted to the point that he's just like really uncomfortable with small talk and meeting new people. And it sounds like Elizabeth feels this way to the same extent. They have this conversation at a party, and they talk about how we are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room. So I think if you're like an introverted person who feels the same way, you can kind of like relate and connect to this relationship. I mean, it's definitely more compelling than the Mr. Bingley-Jane relationship. I mean, they're just two super affable, good-looking people who just get along, and it is the most boring relationship to ever be put down on paper. Oddly enough, my favorite characters in this book were all the annoying, pretentious people who just get roasted by all the other characters. But I have to say, like, I loved Mary Bennet, who's always got her head stuck in books, and she thinks she understands life because of the things that she's read, which is adorable. And you've got Mr. Collins, who just makes me so uncomfortable in a delightful way. And of course, his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is ridiculous, but I really enjoyed reading any scene with her. Jane Austen is also really good at writing mean girls. Like, Caroline Bingley is such a snake, and also those kind of self-centered, oblivious girls who really only care about their own happiness and feel sorry for people who aren't like them, like Lydia Bennet. So I did enjoy the kind of wide cast of characters in this book, and I enjoyed the first half a lot, especially setting up the situation. I just didn't quite connect to the second half of this book, where it felt like it was just more following through with the plot, if that makes sense. But that being said, I am glad that I gave this book a chance. I did enjoy it for the most part, and I would definitely be open to returning back to Jane Austen and reading some more of her books in the future. So if you, like me, have been avoiding Pride and Prejudice because you think it's kind of like a fluffy romance book, I would like to encourage you to maybe give it a shot at some point in your life. There's enough substance underneath this story to keep you interested, I think. I'd love to hear your opinions about this book down below. If you've read Pride and Prejudice, did you love it, hate it, or feel kind of ambivalent towards it? If you haven't read this book, are you planning on reading it, or do you feel put off by it, or are you really excited to get around to it? I'd love to continue this conversation. So let's talk down below. This is all I've got to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again some other time.